Okay, let's talk about Long Black Song. And then Sadie will present. And there's always so many things to talk about. So we've got questions about Long Black Song. The biggest question is whether or not you view, I can't remember her name. Ruth, thank you.
Isn't it?
Is it Ruth?
The baby.
Sarah.
The baby's Ruth,
Sarah.
Sarah. Biblical names.
And the guy's Silas.
Yes, another biblical name. So there's your naming for you.
Yes.
What is the biblical significance of all of these? Don't answer me now. But whether the encounter between Sarah and the salesman is consensual or not. And then we can talk about the dynamics of power and what else goes on in the story.
We know he comes on to her, the salesman comes on to her,
Yes.
and we know she ends up taking him to her room, but was it really consensual, or was she...
While I was reading it, in my opinion, I thought she ran away from him to her room and he followed her.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it was consensual.
Okay. Sadie, what were you going to say earlier?
About the whole portrayal thing, that I don't think it was a betrayal at all. So
Okay.
I
So
guess
you don't
that
think
means
Sarah
that-
was betraying Silas?
Mm-mm.
Okay. So let's go to where is this image? Okay, on 137. Well, it starts on 135. He's starting to grope her, and she's saying no, and she keeps repeating to herself on 135 and 136 that he's a white man, a white man. On 136, she says, but her knees were loose and she heard her own breathing. She was trying to keep from falling, but he's a white man. So we have to ask ourselves why she keeps saying that. But then on the next page, she has fallen and he helped her out. She could not see the stars now. Her eyes were full of the feeling that surged over her body each time she caught her breath. He held her close, breathing into her ear. She straightened rigidly, feeling that she had to straighten or die. And then her lips felt his, and she held her breath and dreaded ever to breathe again for fear of the feeling that would sweep down over her limbs. She held tightly, hearing a mounting tide of blood beating against her throat and temples. Then she gripped him, tore her face away, emptied her lungs in one long, despairing gasp, and went limp. She felt his hand. She was still taut, feeling his hand, then his fingers. The muscles in her legs flexed, and she bit her lips and pushed her toes deep into the wet dust by the side of the well, and tried to wait until she could wait no longer. She whirled away from him, and a streak of silver and blue swept across her blood. The wet ground cooled her palms and kneecaps. She stumbled up and ran blindly, her toes flicking warm, dry dust. Her numbed fingers grabbed at a rusty nail in the post at the porch, and she pushed ahead of hands that held her breasts. Her fingers found the door facing. She moved into the darkened room, her hands before her. She touched the cradle and turned till her knees hit the bed. She went over, face down, her fingers trembling in the crumpled folds of his shirt. She moved and moved again and again, trying to keep ahead of the warm flood of blood that sought to catch her. A liquid metal covered her, and she rode on the curve of white, bright days and dark, black nights, and the surge of the long gladness of summer and the ebb of the deep dream of sleep in winter, till a high red wave of hotness drowned her in a deluge of silver and blue that boiled her blood and blistered her flesh. Bang, bang, bang.
Well, it doesn't sound to me like that's coercion.
Coercion?
Well, or that he raped her.
Okay. Well, what do you all think?
I think he raped her.
You think he raped
I
her?
think he raped her because I don't think she thought she could say no because she's a woman alone and she just had a baby. Like,
Okay.
She couldn't say she couldn't say no because he was a white man.
Okay.
She couldn't properly defend herself because she couldn't like hurt him or anything.
Okay. What were you gonna
The
say?
only thing that makes me think, because I keep going back and forth, the only thing that makes me think it was consensual is why did she not tell Silas that she was raped? I mean, the result would have been the same. The white man would have been killed and Silas would have been killed. But she, I don't know, but would he have kicked her out, made her leave if she had been raped versus
Okay.
him thinking that this is what she wanted?
Okay. So.
Well, the way she describes her feelings,
Mhm.
it's hard to say whether it's the way fear would overtake her or passion
Right.
overtakes her.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. The thing that leads me most towards rape is
Okay.
not telling Silas.
So.
I mean, that it was consensual, so not telling Silas.
Bunch of things to say. Feelings of desire or passion legally do not determine whether or not something was rape. You can be raped and have an orgasm. Scientific, biological fact. But beyond that, part of what McCarthy talks about, especially, is, I think Karen talks about it too, repetition in the stories. The repetition of certain phrases, descriptors, words, symbols, etc. And a lot of these are color details in Wright's work. In this collection specifically, you can look at when he uses silver, blue, red, especially blue and red, but silver as well, and metal. He always associates metal and metallic with blood and violence and pain. If you go back to Fire and Cloud, when Reverend Taylor is being whipped, he talks about the metal coming down over him.
I noticed that, and that's why I thought it was
Yeah, the
more of a
silver-
rape.
The silvery,
Mm-hmm.
the
that she
silver
sees.
coming down over him. So that's,
And because it comes over her also.
yes. And that last line that it's boiling her blood and blistering her flesh. That's also not particularly pleasant. When we talk about something making our blood boil, that's made us angry in American English. So the language that he uses, the metal, the silvery, connects to the other instances of violence in the stories, as kind of a metaphor for the feeling of pain. Or as, I mean, it's almost this sort of synesthetic experience. So synesthesia, connecting one sensation, one sense with another sensation so that the physical sensation becomes a color. But we also, I think about the metallic taste of blood too, when Wright talks about the metal. So then we've got taste pulled into the equation too. But then the bigger issue is the power dynamic between a white man and a black woman, regardless of whether she's alone in the middle of country or not. That in this time period, because we're supposed to be just post World War I, because Tom hasn't come back from France, but another soldier has just come back from France and been killed. You know, 1918, 1919 is still only 50 years after the end of slavery. 55 years. That Silas and Sarah are Uncle Tom's children. Their parents would have been born in slavery. And they would have grown up during Reconstruction.
See, I think the reason I thought this was betrayal was because Silas knows about Tom, the man that Sarah loved. And you can't leave, because I was looking at McCarthy's essay, you can't leave Tom out of this
Right.
formula.
We're coming next. We're coming to
Okay.
Tom. Well, what about Tom?
Well, I mean, Sarah's still in love with him. She's sort of like Hurston.
In their eyes, we're watching that.
Yes, because she marries him. She marries Silas. She doesn't love him. It's like when Hurston's character, Janie, marries the guy her grandmother makes him marry. She doesn't love him. And the two characters remind me very much of each other, of how they're very hardworking, but there's no fun in them, and the
Right.
women are looking for more,
Yes.
and they don't get it.
And I think,
But they know it. The men know it.
right, and I think that is part of what Wright's trying to do, is that this is his woman story. Bright and Morning Star also becomes mostly a woman's story. But here, he's also talking about the position, not just the position of the black woman in regards to the white man, but also to black men
Yeah.
and the rest of her community.
And it wouldn't have mattered because she doesn't tell him either way. She doesn't say anything, really. And his blood is boiling because of what was done, and he takes out on the salesman what he feels for Tom. And he's even accusing her of it.
Yes. Where- At one point, okay. Now we can talk about why she lies. Really quickly. Or why she doesn't plan on telling Silas. One, I think there's the logic, or not logic, the reality that rape victims don't always report what's happened to them immediately. And not always to the person you would think they would tell about it. So I feel like this is a very realistic depiction in some ways. What were you going to say, Tara?
I felt like maybe a reason she didn't tell Silas is because of Silas's hate for white people. Maybe she felt like he would see her somehow tainted by the fact, and that's why she didn't.
Well, he does.
He does, and it's not just that she's well, and he doesn't even know that she's been raped. He thinks that it's consensual, and that's one way we can get confused. He thinks that she's willingly slept with this man in exchange for the graphophone, thereby making her a prostitute, and that's the equation in his mind. I think the other reason why she lies to him is for his own protection. Is that she doesn't tell him because she knows then he will get violent and will try to kill the man when he comes back the next day, or kill somebody.
Well, yeah, and he throws her out of the house.
And he throws her, but I think it's more that she's trying to protect him from himself
Yeah.
than protect her from him. I also think there's not a long period of time between the salesman leaves and Silas comes down the road.
She's still in shock.
Right, there's shock, and she's also possibly thinking, well, if I don't tell him, he'll never know. And that'll protect him from himself and protect her from him. But she, of course, doesn't realize that the handkerchief, the little pencil, the hat are still all there, on top of the graphophone being there. And just the shock of this just happened. And she's just still kind of sitting there when she hears Silas coming down, or coming up the road. That there is, she hasn't had time to process it.
What they did to Silas was very real.
Yes. Well, everything in the collection is very real, and that's what McCarthy talks about, that it is sort of an alternate history or a history through fiction. I think the interesting thing that Wright does in the story is that we don't see Silas die. We don't see his body afterward.
They just don't see him come out and then burn the house down.
Right, but then she says there's just nothing there. There's no screams ever. It's almost like Silas has somehow escaped in that silence. That she's watching and waiting for some sign from him, and there is no sign. So it's almost like Sarah can say, well, he wasn't there. The other thing I was going to say is that there may have been something more between Sarah and Tom. Because, and I just lost my page.
Well, Silas thinks there was.
Right. At one point when they're fighting and she has said that it will cost $40 for the graphophone instead of $50, and he's saying, why do you say it would cost $50? And she's saying, I just got mixed up. And Silas yells, you lying to me, and you lied to me about Tom too. So we have to know, is it that she was lying that she's still in love with him, or that she didn't love him, or did she sleep with Tom at some point? And that's an initial betrayal. Had she had sex with Tom before she married Silas and then told Silas she hadn't?
That's what I thought, and I also thought Ruth could have been Tom's child.
Well, see, I thought that
possible.
because of how.
The beginning, well,
Yeah.
when she talks about being in the corn, being
Yeah.
with him.
She mentioned some sort of, I can't remember where it is, and that kind of reminded me of losing one's virginity.
Yes, when she talks about that one time,
Yeah.
I think it's on 130. Well, it's on 133. Oh no, that's when she's listening to the music. No, I think it's just when she's.
Let's mirror the beginning.
So 127, 128. Against the plush sky, she saw a white bright day in a green cornfield. And she saw Tom walking in his overalls, and she was with Tom, and he had his arm about her waist. She remembered how weak she had felt, feeling his fingers sinking into the flesh of her hips. Her knees had trembled, and she had had a hard time trying to stand up and not just sink right there to the ground. Yes, that was what Tom had wanted her to do. But she had held Tom up, and he had held her up. They had held each other up to keep from slipping to the ground there in the green cornfield. Lord. Her breath went, and she passed her tongue over her lips. But that was not as exciting as that winter evening when the gray skies were sleeping and she and Tom were coming home from church down dark Lover's Lane. She felt the tips of her teats tingling and touched the front of her dress as she remembered how he had crushed her against him and hurt her. She had closed her eyes and was smelling the acrid scent of dry October leaves, and had gone weak in his arms and had felt she could not breathe anymore, and had torn away and run home. And that sweet ache which had frightened her then was stealing back to her loins now, with the silence and the cricket calls and the red afterglow and bang, bang, bang. Lord, I wonder how it would have been with Tom. So I think they also didn't have sex. I think they stopped, and that she feels that desire. She talks about the tingling, the sweet ache, but that her and Tom never actually did have sex, because they held each other up to keep from slipping to the ground, which is where they wanted to be. And she runs away from Tom too. When she felt she could not breathe anymore, she had torn away and run home. So there is this replaying of her encounter with Tom in her encounter with the salesman, and that they become entangled. But I also think that moment when Wright says that she's grabbing for the rusty nail in the door frame, I thought that was going to become a weapon the first time I read this. That she was trying to pull the nail out